Hi everyone, this is Jodi Robinson. Welcome to this episode of Dual Process, where each month we choose a different quilt and we give you one hand-guided design idea as well as one computerized quilting design idea for the same quilt. If you are wanting to draw along, be sure to download and print out your printable, and let's get started. Hi everyone, it's Jodi. So this month's quilt, we're working with this pretty awesome quilt. It has the 3 on point squares, and then the rest is really just open space. I guess that would depend, of course, upon which fabrics were used. But when I looked at this, the first thing I saw was that there would be a flower in each of these. So then I had to start thinking about, well, what would go with that? And my initial thought is probably leaves. And so I also thought about how could I make this to be each pass is kind of continuous. And so that's kind of what we're going to do. So let me get a different color here. And you'll notice that in this yellow, I've marked these random, just totally random, wavy lines, knowing that depending on how big these squares are, I may or may not be able to reach, more than the square itself. And so what I'm going to do is not actually stitch these lines that I marked. I'm just going to use them as a guide for like the spine on the leaves. So what I want to do, of course, is we're going to start up here at the top. And I'm going to go ahead and stitch the leaves along this. And as I stitch, what's going to happen is that it's going to fill in these areas. Now, you do want to be mindful at the top there because don't want to get too close to the edge so that when you bind it, you don't cut off your leaves. And then the goal was to fill the whole body of the quilt besides the squares with these leaves. And so I want to be careful to make sure as I'm stitching along here, I go down to the square, but not into it. We're going to take care of those in the next pass. Remembering that that next row needs space for those leaves to be. And because I'm doing these, left, right, both sides at once, it's going to form the spine for me. So I don't really need to stitch that spine. Now, one thing to keep in mind too is that you don't want to, I kind of make a point to do different size leaves so that when we come back, the next row will nest in with that. And then I like to just go as if I was putting another one right off the edge. And now at this point, we can just travel down along the edge of the quilt, and we're going to alternate because we're here. So we're going to work back the other direction for this row. And we're just going to do the same thing. And it really does, I think, make them look a lot more flowing, and they kind of nest together better when you alternate directions on them like this. And so they're all different sizes. I'm making sure I don't go too far, though, that there's not room for the leaves on the next row. Some longer, some shorter. I want to make sure I go all the way up to that square. Okay, so now when we get to this square, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and I definitely would want to stitch in the ditch around these squares just so that they're separated and they're defined. So at this point, right from this corner, I'm going to go ahead and I would stitch in the ditch here. A little wobbly. Now, I didn't, but I would have put a little dot in the center so I at least know what I'm aiming for here. And so I'm going to go straight in. I'm going to make a circle in the center. It wasn't very circly. And now I'm going to stitch the petals on the flower, and I'm going to keep them within And you see how you want to leave a gap here between two petals, because we need to get out of there and we don't want to have to go through our petal. Now I'm back where I started. I'm going to do a little swirl, and that's going to enable me to move to the other side, straight out, and I can continue right into these leaves. So let's finish this one. And at this point, you're probably, depending on the quilt, you at this point may need to advance your quilt. So again, advance the quilt. I will have traveled as far down as I can. Now this one's just leaves. We're not going to run into another flower on this one. So I'm just going to do the same thing. This time we're going the other direction, alternating the length of the leaves, making sure to go down to the square and make sure there are leaves filling every part of that background. Just work my way across. And see, now we can go up here and it makes them kind of nest in a little better on the top there. Just keep going to the other edge, travel down, and then work our way back. Just keep doing this. I just want to do one more flower for you so that you can see that. Maybe getting those a little bit long, but that's okay. Put one more in there. So now we get to that square again. We go ahead and stitch that in the ditch. Well, that's not very in the ditch. And then I'm going to go in, make my circle, and then I'm going to go ahead and add these petals. Making sure that this gap is on the halfway point. It back to the very center where I started, a little swirl to help me travel, and then right out between those two petals and continue on, filling in with your leaves. Again, you'd probably want to advance, so I'm going to go ahead and finish up these last few rows. Okay, so that brings us to the end of all of the rows across the quilt, and I think it really, you know, it works well because it's like a flowing vine of leaves and it has the flower. Of course, you could change that. You could put any design you want, anything that runs like along a spine, like maybe you want to add feathers in there. And I did neglect to do the inner because these are so small on here, but on the finished drawing, you can see that after I stitched each of these flowers, I did go back around one more time and add a small echo inside the leaves. And that would be, you don't have to do that. For me, the determining factor on that would probably be how big those squares are. I mean, if those were an 8-inch square on point, you'd probably be fine to just do just the petal. But if this was a bigger square where this area inside here is going to be really open, then you would probably want to go back and add that little echo in each petal, because then it's going to give you a little more quilting in there. So I hope you guys enjoy that.
Hey friends, so today we're using this pattern called 3 squares on point. If I move these over here. So here is the quilt top, 3 squares on point. This one honestly was kind of challenging to me. Normally when I'm choosing patterns, I rely on the fabrics a lot. So if this was like a florally fabric, then I would choose maybe a florally feather or a flower design, maybe a motif. So without fabric choices and just having the geometric shapes, I had so many options, so many. But in the end, I think playing with projects like this is just going to make us stronger quilters, because we're going to start to think differently when pulling our patterns, and that's a good thing. So this is how it looks once the patterns were placed and quilted. So when actually stitching this, I would recommend loading it sideways, because then, depending on your quiltable space, you should be able to quilt this as one row, this is an entire row, and then this would be a couple of rows, depending on your space. So here's what I did. I chose this PT Celtic Circles pattern. Let's pull this over here so you guys can see it. And this pattern is by Judith Craker? Sorry, Judith, I never pronounced your name correctly. But anyhow, so it's PT Celtic Circles, and you can see this little note down here. This pattern is not stitchable, and that's because I have not purchased it yet. I went onto the pattern cloud via the store tab here and searched through the patterns until I found some that I liked. And so when you do that, you can audition them, play with them, see if they're going to look like. You just can't stitch them out. So that's a great way to broaden your pattern choices for your clients without spending extra money, because if they don't like that pattern, you didn't waste any money and you can choose a different one. So using repeat patterns, I placed the patterns in here, and I've just put the patterns off to the side right now. So just so that for demonstration purposes, it goes a little faster. And of course, you can always make this pattern as dense or less dense as you want. One thing I want to point out is you may want to do your mock-up first, making sure these line up, then use your arrow keys to shift them down to where they belong. And then same thing here for this bottom row. Line them up, and then shift them down using your arrow keys to where it belongs. There we go. Now we're ready to place our patterns in here. So for the center blocks here, the 3 squares, I choose this pattern here, which is KP Glam Block Sunrise, and this is by Carly Porter. And again, I have not purchased this yet, so that has a little note here that this pattern is not stitchable. And what I love about this one, we shrink it on down and bring it over here, is that it's one block, but it looks like it's multiple patterns. So you're gonna stitch it out relatively fast. It looks like you've custom quilted it. It looks like this whole area in here was one pattern, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 patterns behind it, even though it's one block. So you get that really great custom quilted look without spending a lot of time placing patterns. So we'll put all 3 of those in there. So now for the sashing blocks, these rectangles, I went into the store tab and I actually searched for double wedding ring melons because they're the perfect shape to fit in there. So this one is by Karen Marchetti, and the name of it is KM_DWR Melon 3. And once again, this is not stitchable because we have not purchased it yet. But when we bring it on over here, it coordinates perfectly with this center block. It is just so cohesive. And it looks like they were made for each other. So we're going to shrink it down to fit. But we still have some negative space. So to solve that, we can echo this pattern. Perfect. So now that really fills the space. And you can make it even a little bigger if you'd like. And then we'll just rubber stamp it into the other blocks. So one right there, one right here, and one right here. Perfect. Now, when we stitch this out, you'd want to stitch out this row, this top row first. But unless you really want to stitch off the quilt, I'd recommend that you fill inside. So let's draw a boundary in here real quick. There we go. Alrighty. Select the patterns, right click and choose fill inside. Perfect. Then you would roll the quilt. When we get to this row, you'd want to do your stitch in the ditch work first. So maybe ditch along there. Definitely ditch along here. And then it's up to you if you would want to ditch on the sashing blocks as well. Personal preference. Then you would stitch out all these patterns here in this second row. And because you've ditched it, you don't have to worry about shrinkage that much, and you can decide if you're going to quilt these blocks first and then go back and do the sashings, or maybe you just quilt them out, 1, 2, 3, 4. A big part of that decision will be, are you using the same shade of thread or are you using 2 different color threads? Because then you'd want to stitch out everything that was one color first and then go back and stitch out everything that's the other color afterwards. Then you'll roll your quilt. When you get to the bottom portion of this quilt, the first thing to remember is that prior to this, when you place your patterns, make sure you can fit an entire row in your quiltable space. So this will fit in my quiltable space. Otherwise, I would have made the pattern smaller to begin with. And we're going to need to fill these. But I can't fit the whole thing in my quiltable space, which means we're going to have to fill one row at a time. So let's just shift this last row down a little bit and draw our boundary for our quiltable space along the edge of our quilt top here. But this bottom part of this row, we're going to leave extra space so that when we fill inside, there we go, it didn't disrupt the pattern at the bottom. It didn't alter it at all, which means now we could stitch out this row. So after this second row has been quilted out, we can work on the bottom row. But for the same thing, when we do our fill, we don't want to alter this top portion of the pattern. So when we draw our boundary for the fill, we're going to go like this, just like we did with the row above, leave some space. And we're going to have to shift this bottom row of patterns up. So we're going to make our boundary a little bit bigger here, just like so. Alrighty, now we can fill inside. We can delete the boundary, select this bottom row of patterns, and shift them up. And now we just have to worry about this very, very, very bottom. So we have two options. We could do another fill just along here, like so. And then choose these patterns and fill outside. Okay, so that's one option. Or you could trim it. So we could draw trim using trim inside and draw a trim like this. And now where this yellow box is will not be stitched. So that's up to you, whichever one you want to use. And here's what our finished quilt would look like. I love it. If you do a mock-up, please share it with us on social media. Use the hashtag #GamelQuilting. Thanks for watching this episode of Dual Process. We hope that it has inspired you. Till next time, thanks for watching.